I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
The late Qing, which is a weird period.
The late what?
Qing Dynasty, late Qing Dynasty. So
1640?
Oh, right. Right.
To 1911, 1912. And late Qing, you said, is the last 30 years?
That's usually, I mean, you can date it a little further back if you want, but that's sort of the standard. Because a lot of, they typically, what happens is you look towards the end of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, which brings you into about the 1870s.
So the first Opium War was 1840s, the second one was 1860s, so yeah, I guess.
There's also a war with France in there.
Yeah.
Anyway, a lot of bad
wars.
stuff happens, yeah. Anyway, but the late Qing is odd and a lot of fun. We're talking about arguably the most important intellectual in late Qing China, Liang Qichao, who was a pioneer in bringing sort of Western literature to China, largely in translation. He didn't write a lot of his own original stuff, but he founded, I don't even know how many literary journals.
A lot. He was involved in newspapers.
Yeah, he did a lot of his own translations in the late 19th century.
And like many intellectuals from this period, he was from Guangdong, which is the southeast corner of China, where kind of Hong Kong is now sort of a part of Guangdong. And he was born in 1873, died in 1929. So he really kind of spanned the late Qing to the early Republican.
Yeah. And the stuff we're going to be talking about today, he wrote basically in exile in Tokyo.
1902, I think.
After the 100 Days Reform, it's called, when a number of intellectuals led by Kang Youwei send a memorial to the emperor basically saying, here's all the stuff that's wrong, here's how we need to fix it, except that the emperor really wasn't. Well, he was in power, but he didn't have much power. The Dowager Empress Cixi was the one pulling the strings, and she didn't appreciate this.
So it didn't last very long.
That's why it's the 100 Days Reform.
Yeah, that's 1898, and so he's writing this in 1902.
Yeah. So he goes to Tokyo, and like a lot of Chinese intellectuals at that period who were in Tokyo.
There was a huge community of
Lu
Chinese
Xun cut his teeth in Tokyo. Zhou Zuoren, his brother, in Tokyo. A lot of people. China's first feminist movement started in Tokyo among women sent by the imperial court to study in Tokyo. A lot of stuff happens in Japan. So Liang Qichao comes across a lot of Western stuff in translation in Japan.
Quote, unquote, Western.
Yeah. European, anyway. Yeah. But some Russian and I think
American.
Also, yeah. And is intrigued by it. He'd read enough before to understand a lot of what was coming out of Europe, but Tokyo is really where, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on here.
In some ways, Tokyo is the most important city anywhere, including in China, to Chinese modernization at certain periods.
If it was the sort of, later on, Shanghai would be called the Paris of the East, but really, in terms of its cultural importance at this point, it's Tokyo. Tokyo is the place in Asia where the stuff from the rest of the world comes, at least in terms of culture. This is where you find the translations. This is where you find all the stuff. You know,
part of that is because all of these Chinese intellectuals are studying there.
Yeah,
but also part of it is just kind of an issue of freedom. Liang Qichao had to leave in 1898 because he was concerned with his life. He was concerned with that the imperial family was going to try and kill him, and he would not
unreasonably so.
Right? They I believe did kill some other people in the 1890 after the 1898 100 Days Reform, but he would not have had the freedom to publish or write this in China.
No way.
So in some ways, Tokyo is the hot spot because of the sort of freedom of speech that it allowed for Chinese writers and intellectuals. Not necessarily that the Japanese government at this time was, a democracy, because it was not entirely. There were some democratic elements, but at least if you were Chinese, the Japanese government was not really concerned with what you were doing.
Right. And so, this is actually a pretty decent segue to talk about some of the stuff that he wrote, but the piece in particular we're going to talk about is the preface to the first issue of a journal he published called 新小说, new fiction or new novel. We're going to talk about why that matters, that distinction here in a second. And it amounts to kind of a manifesto. Lee, do you want to read the first couple of sentences just to let people know kind of what they're dealing with?
Yeah, this is the first sentence. So right out of the gate, if one intends to renovate the people of a nation, one must first renovate its fiction.
Yeah. And it goes on. If you intend to renovate this, you have to renovate the fiction. How about this? Also fiction. And he goes on to basically say, look, the reason that China is still where it is because we still have all the same old stuff.
Stuff being fiction, right?
Yeah, but this is what's interesting, and I think it's a either misunderstood or misrepresented point, because 小说 in Chinese, it's perfectly reasonable to translate it as fiction, but it's also a genre. It can be read as a genre of writing, vernacular fiction that has representative works like The Water Margin and Dream of Red Chambers or Story of the Stone, things like this. So when we read fiction in English, that's a massive... It's basically anything that's not history or science or something like that. In the Chinese context, 小说 had been used for quite a long time to refer to a specific kind of writing.
What kind of writing?
Well, it was a vernacular novel. You wouldn't call something fiction that was, say, Confucius. Even Zhuangzi's parables, which are fictional, that would not be 小说. Like, there's a specific thing, the novel.
And fiction is functioning in an interesting way here, because it comes to China, I would say, fairly late. And it in the word fiction, 小说, actually doesn't just include novels, like long novels, like what we think of as novels, but also short stories too.
Yeah, well, shorter stories, yeah. And when you say it came to China late, it is interesting because, if we're talking about the Ming, that's like 600 years before this. So it's not exactly a brand new thing, Now, of course, the question of were they calling it that then? Probably not. I mean, any genre sort of has its name later.
I think they were calling it that then, but I guess I would make the point that at least kind of, if you think about Western civilization or Indian civilization, you have epic poetry that is, in existence 3,000 years ago.
Right.
That's not happening in China.
Right, but I think that's my point, though, is there are things that are fictional in Chinese literary history, but this is something a little different. I was going to say, though, it changes how you think about what he's saying, right? Because the standard sort of approach is that he's calling for, like, European fiction. We need, Charles Dickens. We need the biggies in Europe, and we need to bring them over here, right?
And he's specifically kind of downing on Chinese fiction, too, right? Mm-hmm. He has a bone to pick with both Shui Hu Zhuan and Hong Lo Meng. That's The Water Margins, and sometimes translated, the other novel is sometimes translated Dream of the Red Chamber, sometimes Story of the Stone. But yeah, why? Those are definitely 小说, the fiction that he's talking about, and he specifically references those. What is so bad about them? Why are they destroying? He claims that they are destroying China. They're literally destroying China,
which is not an unusual thought in the late Qing, or not just the late Qing, the Qing period, which is that. And it's kind of funny when we think about what gets said today about a lot of TV programs and stuff. Like, so the 小说 is just destroying people's minds. So stuff like Hong Lo Meng causes people to indulge in lustful thoughts and the pleasures of the flesh. Shui Hu Zhuan gives them unreasonable expectations about martial valor and things like that. The idea being that when you read a thing and you feel something because of that thing, it's going to cause you to act in a certain way, which isn't unreasonable. But a lot of scholars in the Qing had a deep-seated fear of something that was really, really popular, right? Because if it was really popular, then doesn't that just mean that the masses are just indulging in the same fantasy and they're not paying attention to anything else?
I want to push back against that, because I'm not entirely sure that he never seems to me to suggest because something is popular, it's bad. He seems to say that all of the things that are bad, all of the bad fiction is popular.
What's the difference?
I don't think that the fact that it's popular, I don't think Liang Qichao is suggesting that the fact that something is popular
makes it bad.
Mm-hmm. It's something else that people, normal people, the masses, will say, are drawn to bad things that are destroying China, things like Honglo-Meng or Shui
I think that's a very, very thin line, because he doesn't use the word bad, and he doesn't say outright, if it's popular, it's bad. What he does say is that there's something dangerous and almost out of control about things that are super popular. He finds he thinks it's weird, for example, that you have, say, Dream of Red Chambers, that everyone is still reading this. Like, that's even writers are just echoing it. If it's a love story, it's got to sound like this. If it's a story about martial heroes, it's got to sound like The Water Margin, that sort of thing.
So let me just read a quote.
Go for it.
Nowadays, our people readily forsake the virtues of honesty and righteousness and engage themselves in risky intrigues and schemes. Everyone has become harsh, cold, and crafty, and the whole nation is in great trouble. This is all because of fiction. I'm using Kirk Denton's translation here. So fiction is the cause of the nation's ills, at least. That's how is there any other way to read that?
I don't think, yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, though, I think it's important still to point out that he's not talking about fiction in the sense that something that's made up or untrue, because there's a ton of stuff in the Chinese tradition, like some of those things we've already talked about on the podcast from Zhuangzi, like that. None of that's true. I mean, the dragons are talking to river spirits, but the fiction here as a genre of writing is an important distinction, because it's circulating differently, it's being read differently, it's being bought differently.
I don't really understand the point that you're making with like true and false. I don't know that Liang Qichao would have made that same distinction.
But he's not. But that's my point, is that when we talk about xiaoshuo as a if you just say fiction, basically when we think of fiction in the West, or at least in the U.S. as we're talking right now, at least in my mind, when I hear fiction, I think anything that is not science, history. Like an Isaac Asimov novel is fiction. A one paragraph made up story in a magazine is fiction. It's fiction because it's not a lot of these other things, right? It's things that you have to prove empirically.
Why is that distinction so important for you? I'm not getting that.
Because if you just say fiction has been the downfall of China, in the Western context, that's basically anything that's imagined or made up, right? Even something fairly realistic is still imagined or made up. But if we're talking here just about a kind of writing, a specific kind of writing, it's important because he's saying we need a new kind of this thing, right? It's not just new imagined works. We need a new kind of novel, right?
When you say new, are you talking about new in terms of content or new in terms of form? And
this is the interesting thing about this essay, because a lot of times it just gets read as he's calling for just new everything. We need new styles of writing. We need new themes. But if you read the translations and the works that he's putting out in some of his journals, they don't read all that differently from the stuff that's come before it. And a lot of times it's even aping some of the stuff that he claims is not very good, right? Because there's a certain genre of writing, and if you're going to write within that genre, you're going to have stuff from that genre. I mean, if I say I'm going to write a brand new realist novel, right? In order for it to even be recognized as that, it has to have traces of that in there, something in there that people are going to recognize as, oh, I see what he's doing there. He's playing with those elements of the novel in a new way. He's not doing something that's entirely different. So when I read Liang Qichao here, that's what I'm reading, is he's calling for new stuff to be put into an old genre, but he's not calling for a completely new thing that has never existed in China. And I think that's important, right? Because it explains partly why, like, if you read it as a brand new anything, everything has to be different. It's kind of a failure when you read what he's putting out there, because it doesn't read that way at all, you know? You're like, well, that's kind of new, but it also sounds kind of old too, you know? And it's, I mean, he's upgrading an old genre.
I should make the point that he also called for a revolution in poetry. His essay, which was written, I think, a little bit later than this on a trip from Tokyo to Honolulu, he called for a 世界革命, so a revolution in what poetry is or something like that. And in it, he actually tries to claim that it's not just it's language that needs to be rethought and re-engaged. And he actually advocates using a totally different kind of Chinese, one that engages with Japanese loanwords. And even in this essay, he's using a ton of these like crazy Buddhist metaphors to talk about what poetry does. And it's very, very weird.
Right.
Like it's weird just even now reading it.
Which is why I think it's one of the reasons I find the late Qing so fascinating is they are...
It's so weird.
It's the hinge point for everything that comes after it, in the sense that these people are finally going... People like Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei are going, you know what? What would happen if we did throw this stuff into the mix? Like, Kang Youwei trying to explain the Confucian concept of Li through the idea of electricity in science. Like, what in the world?
There is a scholar at Harvard, David Wong, who is the guy who's kind of rethought what the late Qing means and what its relevance is. And he makes the argument that the May 4th, everybody looks to the May 4th, which is the period that comes after this, 1919, around that period, as the starting point of modern Chinese literature. This is where it began. Here, Chinese literature started on this date.
Yeah.
And David Wong says, hang on, wait a minute. Actually, maybe we can see some like incipient buds sprouting from the late Qing. And I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing Liang Qichao move. He's trying to grasp for something new, but a lot of what he's doing is just the same old stuff, and it's the same old wine in a new bottle, right?
Right, which is still very important to point out, because if you're trying to change the way people think, which is what he at least claims to want to do, you're not going to do that if you publish something that no one wants to read. So there has to be something recognizable if you're going to sell it. And a lot of times when we talk about literature, the idea of commercialization gets thrown out there like a swear word. It certainly does for May 4th writers later on. Lu Xun detested, or said he did, a lot of the stuff produced in this period, some of which he himself produced. Anyway, because it was just crass commercialization. But it was partly because of the crass commercialization that writers actually made enough money to then go ahead and say, you know what, I am going to write something that no one's ever read here before, understanding that it's probably not going to sell too well.
But a lot of writers did sell mega hits.
Yeah, but and it changed the way everything was written, because before this, if you wanted to make money off of something you wrote, you had to either have a patron or it had to be commissioned somehow. That was it. Your job wasn't writing. Like, you didn't have a career as a writer.
The mass mediaification, if I will, of fiction changed. It gave writers a lot more freedom in this period. And we're seeing Liang Qichao as a kind of result of that.
Yeah, and it's a fairly canny manipulation of an old genre. This is why I think it's important to think of it as a genre, because he's still using familiar elements that people are going to understand how to read. This is something that Lu Xun is also doing in his translations, also in Tokyo about this time, is he's taking stuff that everyone is familiar with and using those elements alongside content from, say, Jules Verne or Victor Hugo, or in Liang Qichao's case, also Jules Verne. He's trying to bring them together, which is why I'm saying he's trying to upgrade an old genre, but he's not trying to create a brand new genre. That kind of stuff would come later, and is also why when Lu Xun and his brother Zhou Zoren had their own translation journal in 1907 in Tokyo, no one read it, because what they were doing was saying, you know what, we're not going to do that old kind of translation. We are going to give people the real capital L literature from Europe, and it's going to be exactly like it. We're not going to bring in anything that people are used to.
They said, we're going to give you the literature you should be reading, not the literature you want to read.
Right.
And it totally bombed.
It totally bombed, and Zhou Zuoren has, had some published reflections about it later where he sort of rolls his eyes and like, yeah, it was interesting, but basically nobody read it in Tokyo or Shanghai, or was originally later circulated. So a lot of this sort of combination of popular and new is what paves the way for later stuff. There would not have been a May 4th movement had there not already been this explosion, this publishing explosion in Shanghai and other major cities.
I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
Just it's peculiar to read this stuff, but it's worth paying attention to just because of all the newness that's coming into China and being consciously used in this way.
It's totally weird, like the arguments that they're making.
Yeah.
He makes the argument that fiction can destroy a nation, which I don't know. I don't know if we believe that anymore. Right. Maybe. I mean, people certainly say, video games can destroy a nation.
You do hear some of that, though. I mean, you have these publishing phenomena like 50 Shades of Grey. And, if you mention that around a lot of sort of hardcore literary scholars, they just gnash their teeth. Everyone's reading garbage. Soon no one's going to know how to read. It's similar in tone, right? Yeah. Whenever something gets really popular and it's not Shakespeare, Proust, or something like that, scholars just can't stand it.
I think that's a good point to leave it at. 50 Shades of Grey and video games.
I like it.
All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.